Okay, so it's 12 sharp in Moscow, so I guess we can get started. My name is Margarita Rudnik. I work at the Ministry of Economic Development of the Russian Federation, and I will be your moderator today. So as you probably know, our ministry has started a big project on trying to understand what does this proliferation of remote work means for the economy, not only for Russia, but also what are the global trends affecting all of us. And we wanted to gather a panel of amazing speakers, which we actually did from different organizations such as OECD, APEC Policy Unit, International Labour Organization, and rest, to talk about all of the various effects, be it on salary, be it on employment, be it on the way we live in the cities, to discuss what are the implications and how we should adapt to this, first of all as governments, but also as citizens and as businesses. So to open the floor, I would like Natalia Stapran, the director of our Department of Multilateral Economic Cooperation and Special Projects, to say just a few words and wish us a productive meeting.
Thank you, Rita. Thank you for moderating. I'm very glad to see all my colleagues, even in remote way of talking, but it's again a chance to meet each other and to talk and to discuss the issues which are really important today. Of course, it's quite symbolic that all of us join this conference remotely, and as well as all gathered together to discuss how remote work and flexible work arrangements will affect the economy and all our economies in the long term. The COVID-19 pandemic forced all of us to try new ways of working during the lockdown. According to the estimates for advanced economies made by BCG, it's up to 40% of workers performed their duties remotely during the quarantine. And we understand that the second wave of pandemic will bring new figures, I guess. Figures also show that workers and businesses saw benefits in this new work formats and would like to continue working remotely in the future. A Russian study by Sberbank and McKinsey shows that almost 70% of employees who tried working remotely would like to have the option to do so in the future. And the majority of them prefer the option to work remotely at least 2 or 3 days a week. So flexible work formats are here to stay, even once we hope the lockdown measures will be lifted. It might be too early for the official forecast, but some consulting firms are already making attempts at projections. For example, Global Workplace Analytics predicts that from 25 to 30% of global workforce will be working from home multiple days a week by the end of 2021. These changes in the way we work are going to have the lasting effects on our economies. For one thing, labor productivity and workforce participation may increase. People who could not fit in the 9-to-5 pattern before would have more opportunities to work flexibly and efficiently. This would affect labor regulation. For example, in Russia, we are currently working on updating our labor laws to include more provisions covering flexible work. International companies has also announced that they would be adapting salary policies to include more remote work provisions. This, in turn, will affect taxation, especially when it comes to cross-border businesses. The changes in the work formats have also affected population flow patterns. According to one Russian study, during the peak of restrictive measures, some 15% of Moscow workers moved to the suburbs or smaller cities. The authors of this report predict that 1 to 2% of Moscow citizens, Muscovites, would remain in these locations for a longer period. Such patterns would inevitably affect urban policies, both in the recipient smaller cities as far as in the mega policies and big cities. Finally, the COVID-19 pandemic accelerated the adoption of digital technology. we are likely to see increased demand of online collaboration tools, and this might potentially form new businesses, new opportunities for the companies that operate in the IT sector. But these observations barely scratch the surface. To think more deeply about these trends, our Ministry of Economic Development, launched a project on remote work to prepare the Russian economy for the proliferation of flexible work. In the international arm of the ministry, we are here monitoring closely key global economic trends and facilitating knowledge exchange between international Russian and international experts. Today, we have gathered a truly impressive panel of speakers. Thank you everyone again for participating, from international organizations such as OECD, ILO, APEC. My dear friends from APEC, really miss you much, as well as representatives of global companies such as Facebook, EY, to name but a few. The results of today's roundtable will inform our project, but I also hope that speakers and listeners would find the discussion thought-provoking, and we will all leave with plenty of food for thought. Thank you again for joining. I wish you all the successful discussion. I hope to stay with you through the discussion and probably to comment sometimes. So very welcome, Rita. Wish you good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. So just in line with how you suggested, we actually will cover quite a few trends, and we have experts in different areas today. So we'll first talk about the overall economic impacts, and here we have some great studies already done on the long-term impact. And then we'll talk about the cities and urban planning, the future of employment and salary and taxes, and then we'll end with digital services, although probably it is the biggest driver behind the whole change. So to begin with, as you mentioned, of course, COVID has already impacted the economy for this year. I think the latest figures we have from OECD is that the global domestic product will drop by 4.5% this year. And of course, the overall effect will be long-term. And I hear that in Asia Pacific, the study was already done by the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council on the long-term effects on the building blocks of the economy, which is businesses and citizens. So I would like to ask the Secretary General of the Council, Eduardo Pedrosa, to comment maybe on 4 or 5 key long-term changes that COVID is bringing to businesses and citizens.
Well, thank you very much. Let me express my great appreciation to the Ministry of Economic Development and to my old friend, Dr. Natalia Stapran, for having me here, and to really congratulate you all for taking on this really fascinating topic. It's extremely timely, and I was very reluctant, I'll admit, to taking on this role, because it's extremely difficult, and we're just beginning to get to grips with what all of this means. We're just beginning this trend. Some of us do work from home. It's been around, but this COVID-19 crisis has really been a massive accelerator for something that's been around. And when I saw the title, The Economic Impact of COVID on Work and Life, I wanted to run away. I have no real answers, but we have done some work on this, and we've been surveying stakeholders and the policy community around the Asia Pacific on this. So what I wanted to do was to share with you the results of that survey and that study. So I'll do that immediately, since time is somewhat limited. So can you see my presentation now? Great.
Full screen.
Okay, great. Is it moving? Okay, great. The thing I wanted to emphasize with you is, well, this is a survey. This is not a survey of public opinion. It's really a survey of the policy community. If we were to ask these kinds of questions to the public, we get a very different set of responses. So the type of people that we survey are government officials. They're at quite a senior level. They work with ministers. They're at quite technical levels. We're asking CEOs from business companies who tend to have international operations, and we're asking people from the non-government sector, from civil society, from the media, and from think tanks. One question that we always ask on risks to growth: what do you think are the top 5 risks to growth for your economy? And what I wanted to point out to everyone here is, apart from the obvious, the health pandemic, the one thing that everyone is worried about are disappearing jobs. That was the second highest risk to growth across the entire Asia Pacific region. But whether you're from North America, Northeast Asia, Oceania, Pacific South America, or Southeast Asia, people are really worried about jobs. And we see that we're going to hear from the ILO later. But really, disappearing jobs are something everyone is across the region are worried about. Now, moving on really to what I think has been the sort of accelerator of this sort of working from home and everything, it's the evolution of workplace restriction measures across the world. But this is data that's been developed by Oxford University. If you look at this as a time series, at the beginning of the year, there were no measures. There was no pandemic. And then gradually, as the pandemic moved on, we had recommended closing or recommended work from home. As the pandemic moved on, there became required closing or work from home for some sectors or some categories of workers. And then the interesting thing was this required closing, all but essential workplaces. I'm here in Singapore, and I'm still working from home. It depends on which jurisdiction you're in, but there are sort of different policies in places. So if you look at that chart there, you'll see that this really reached its apex during in April. Jurisdictions have relaxed that, but that's an important thing to bear in mind. These measures really reached their apex back in April earlier this year. Natalia already referred to the sort of opportunities that came about and collaborations. Here the report we issued talks about the opportunities and changes that come about through digital adoption. There's sort of at the beginning of the year, the sort of average weekly download of business apps at the beginning of the year was about 33 million weekly downloads. Bearing in mind the chart that I showed you by sort of March, April this year, it had more than doubled to 72 and then up to 85 million downloads. If you think about what was happening at that time, we were stuck at home. Our officers had told us, you can't go to work anymore. So we had to download all of these apps. And you see that on that chart on the left side. And the right panel there correlates these two, the level of restrictiveness of workplace closures with the weekly downloads of business applications. This shows a similar chart for the evolution of the adoption of travel restrictions, and this is more specific to the Asia Pacific. So at the beginning, we had some screening measures that were put in place. Then we had quarantine arrivals from high-risk regions, and then we had bans, and then we had total border closures. Again, I'm here in Singapore. We still have total border closures, although we have some green lanes that are beginning to open up. So again, there's still quite a restrictive regime around the world, and this has sort of important consequences for how business will evolve in the future. So this just shows you that around the region, these measures will are continuing to evolve. This sort of plots it out in a neat summary, and there you show it shows you what happened, the inflection point when the WHO declared a global pandemic. This shows you how international travel had been increasing over the years. There had been a hope that we would break 2 billion international travelers this year. However, that was a pre-COVID estimate. The best case scenario this year was for about a halving of that to about 1 billion. now the worst case scenario is less than 500 million travelers. So there's a real impact on international travel. Those of us that work on international policy, we're all stuck doing these Zoom calls around the world. So what are the things you really wanted to understand? And this Margarita gets to your question. What are the consequences of the COVID-19 crisis on the ways in which business is conducted? So we surveyed our policy community on these questions. So some of these are very obvious answers. So 98% of those we surveyed said, yes, we're going to see the long-term increase in the use of virtual meetings. That's a huge increase. That's a huge percentage of people agreeing with that. And that's over the long term. This isn't a short-term thing. This is over the long term. Again, 98% agree with the accelerated growth of the digital economy. For those in the travel industry, this is a big concern. 91% agree that we're going to see the reduced international tourism and business travel. Again, that's a massive finding that we're going to see. Again, 91% agree that we're going to see the increased importance of the gig economy. So that gets to this sort of flexible work arrangements that we're very interested in. 76% agree with increased business costs. And 75% agree with the accelerated growth of services trade. And then on something that I was particularly interested in is we see disagreement on increased wages for workers. So, but there's some variance in that finding there. So here I wanted to sort of look at the sort of the cross-sectoral and cross-regional findings on this. So there is the top line result, 63% disagreed and 37% agreed with that finding. But if we look at the findings for, say, government respondents, 54% of government respondents disagreed with that finding, but 46% agreed with that. For North Americans, 53% disagreed with that, while 47% agreed with that. 79% say from Oceania disagreed with that, while 21% agreed with that. So mixed views around the impact of the COVID crisis on wages. There are long-term studies on the impact of pandemics on wages, where they find that pandemics have actually had a positive impact on wages. So we're very curious about why people think that the crisis will have a negative impact on wages. So I'm very interested in what our discussions will be on this particular issue. I wanted to share with you this very interesting cover from Time magazine, which from 1965, and in this particular issue of Time, they said that automation will bring a 20-hour work week. As little as 2% of the workforce will be employed, and so on. So everything was going to be automated, and this was in 1965. Well, frankly, I'm still waiting. You know, I don't have a 20-hour work week. I seem to have a 20-hour work day. So I'm waiting. So the question I ask is, are we going? You know, is this Back to the Future? I don't think so. I did want to share with you this very interesting chart from Richard Baldwin, who had presented this at one of our meetings, sorry, in Jakarta last year. And this really speaks to what some of the sort of the bigger issues of, yes, generally what we're seeing is there is job displacement happening, but it's really a sort of a speed issue. So there's a mismatch between a replacement of jobs and displacement of jobs. But what I wanted to get to really was this particular survey finding from a couple of years ago, that the policy community that we survey does not think that we are ready for these changes that we are facing. So we asked the question, you know, how do you think our economies and particular aspects of them, so social security, labor markets, and education systems are ready for the changes that we're seeing with the fourth industrial revolution? And there was a very negative finding with respect to that. I know I'm running out of time. So my takeaways are that we've been struck by an unprecedented change. We're going to see enduring consequences for travel. We're going to see there are specific variations across sectors and impacts on wages. We need to disentangle the immediate effects across the labor markets and so on. But I argue that we've been here before. The basic conclusion of our report is that the COVID-19 crisis has accelerated the trends that are already evident, and that's the reason why I showed you those charts. In particular, the digital economy, in particular with the digital economy and the fourth industrial revolution. So I think my time is probably really up, and I hope we can get into some more discussion on that. Thanks, Margarita.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. I think it is the deepest and most knowledgeable presentations that we can get now, given that COVID is still developing and we still might be facing the second wave. I really wonder how the thinking on wages, for example, would change with the second wave. Probably it will become even more negative and depressing. And what worries me most is that everyone agrees that we are not really prepared in the APEC region, but I would assume it's a worldwide trend. So it's very good that we are talking at least today on which measures we can take to prepare more. And it's very interesting that you mentioned the Time Journal of 1965, which was mentioning some kind of industrial revolution and digitalization. And I know that although COVID has accelerated the digitalization trend, like you mentioned, digitalization has already been impacting our employment. And I know APEC policy unit was looking into this more deeply, probably not since 1965, as APEC was founded later, but still there were some studies on how the fourth industrial revolution would affect employment and so on. And we have today with us Emmanuel San Andres from the APEC policy unit, who I know can talk a little bit more in depth what together the COVID impact on employment combined with fourth industrial revolution might mean for the employment. Emmanuel, the floor is yours.
Yep. Thank you, Margarita. Let me share my screen as well. And here we go. Thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues. First, I would like to thank Russia for organizing this roundtable discussion on COVID-19 and employment issues. In the past several months, the world has really been undertaking a vast work from home experiment. Not by choice, but by circumstance. Everyone has been forced to do this. And I think it is very timely to discuss the many implications of this change in working arrangements, as well as in geography of work. The COVID-19 pandemic is a public health and humanitarian crisis. Policies meant to alleviate the human suffering and contain the pandemic have resulted in the worst economic crisis in recent history. The APEC region's economic output is projected to contract by 3.7% this year and lose $2.9 trillion in output, followed optimistically by a 5.7% growth in 2021. We expect more than 23 million people to join the ranks of the unemployed later this year, even with the expected rebound in jobs later this year. Less than half that number will be employed again in 2021. Note that we did these macroeconomic estimates earlier this year when we were still optimistic, but that we will be mostly back to normal by now. But instead, the pandemic is not yet over. We have daily reported cases right now that are not significantly lower compared to the levels in early April. The APEC region still records more than 50,000 new COVID-19 cases per day, while 2,000 people die per day. Some economies have been able to contain the pandemic, while others are still struggling through their first or second waves. What we should take away here is that there is no trade-off between public health and the economy or jobs. Economic recovery and jobs preservation are dependent and predicated in containing the COVID-19 pandemic. This means we can expect extended periods of restrictions of movement, social distancing, and closure of economic sectors with close human contact. We should also point out that this is happening at a time when jobs were already under pressure from what is called the fourth industrial revolution, or 4IR. 4IR is generally the trend towards greater automation and decentralization of economic activity, which is enabled by the proliferation of greater power of digital technology. 4IR has the potential to unleash unprecedented levels of productivity and affluence, as pointed out by Ed Pedrosa a while ago. But there are also far-ranging concerns on the impact of jobs and income security. We have seen this ourselves, where we once needed armies of translators, accountants, and transcribers. We now have translation apps, accounting software, and text-to-speech interfaces. Of course, previous industrial revolutions brought about by technological change have also led to structural changes in our labor market. But this time it looks different, and 4IR is contributing to a net loss in secure and decent jobs. We would not see the impact of 4IR in unemployment numbers, but in the quality of jobs that it generates. Computerization has always been a threat to routine jobs in machine learning, but now 4IR technologies such as AI and machine learning are being applied to non-routine jobs, such as language translation or customer service. You can make a phone call to a computer and not realize that you are not talking to a human after all. On top of this is the increasing precarity of new 4IR jobs, such as those in the gig or sharing economy, plus jobs polarization brought about by automation and mid-skill jobs. Then COVID-19 happened, which has only hastened the adoption of 4IR technologies. As economies scrambled to contain the pandemic, many measures were implemented to minimize the spread of the virus. These included restrictions on transportation and travel, limits to human-to-human interaction, and safety and cleanliness regulations. In some cases, there were also quarantines and lockdowns. As a result, many firms and organizations have adopted digital technology to conduct their business. One clear example is this roundtable discussion, which in pre-COVID times would be done physically in a conference room. Digital technology is enabling work from home and home-based learning arrangements, as well as other transactions such as purchases or necessities or coordination of supply chains and logistics. However, COVID-19 is also teaching even the most technology-resistant firms about the value of digital technology and automation. Before COVID-19, automation was mainly done to reduce costs or to gain market advantage. After COVID-19, new considerations such as healthcare costs and risks, worker safety, legal risk management, and new regulations on social distancing and floor capacity have come into the fore. The expected economic impacts of COVID-19 also make cost reduction a stronger consideration to automate and digitalize operations. It's also important to note that COVID-19 does not affect all people equally. We know by now that the virus is more likely to affect poor, minority, and disadvantaged communities harder. The pandemic is interacting with pre-existing conditions of poverty, food insecurity, and lack of access to healthcare to magnify social and economic inequalities. We are seeing the same differential impacts on jobs. COVID-19 has a stronger negative impact on the elderly and those with pre-existing health conditions. So these workers may be induced to exit from the workforce to minimize their health risks. Firms that previously hired elderly and vulnerable workers may not do so even after the pandemic. Youth and female workers are more likely to be employed in routine and front-facing jobs, such as retail, hospitality, sales, or simple office work, and are therefore more likely to be affected by social distancing, transportation, and floor capacity constraints. Even for workers that can work from home, we are seeing differential impacts across gender. Women shoulder a greater share of household responsibilities due to cultural norms. Work from home and home-based learning arrangements are increasing the number of hours women spend on household responsibilities more than men. This has an impact on the energy and focus of female workers, which could lead to a reduction in poverty and therefore incentivize firms to automate occupations that have a high proportion of female employment. Well-meaning policies could also have unintended consequences in jobs and income security. For example, many economies have implemented monetary and financial measures to support businesses through the pandemic. While lower interest rates can certainly help with access to finance that can weather the economic downturn, it can also reduce the costs of capital-intensive investments such as automation. Likewise, support programs for small businesses to adopt digital technology can incentivize firms to fully embrace automation, even when they can rehire workers. Policies that constrain labor supply and mobility, such as immunity passports or restrictions in hiring of foreign workers, can further tilt firms' preferences towards more robots and less humans in their production. What all this means is that the stable jobs lost in 2020 may not come back even with the hope for recovery starting 2021. Of course, policy has an important role to play in addressing COVID-19 impacts. The pandemic has exacerbated job and income uncertainty for many workers, and the push towards automation and 4IR technologies has made this precarity a permanent fixture in our economies. Economies will need to address and protect workers from the negative impacts of COVID-19 and 4IR, but this should not come at the expense of suppressing innovation and productivity. As the pandemic has caused unparalleled jobs losses and income uncertainty, social protection and safety nets take center stage. During the pandemic, social protection was needed to allow furloughed or terminated workers to stay at home and observe quarantines or lockdown measures, rather than risk their health in trying to find whatever work they can get. Indeed, many economies have had to implement an ad hoc social protection measures earlier this year through temporary universal basic income policies, payroll support through firms, or in-kind distribution of basic goods like food and medicine. Meanwhile, economies with insufficient social protection systems have had to dig deep to support their extended health and unemployment insurance systems. One lesson we can learn from the COVID-19 pandemic is the importance of developing robust and sufficient social protection systems when times are good, so that they will be ready to use when times are bad. Upskilling and retraining of workers is also needed to address the structural challenges brought about by changing technology. Coupled with active labor market policies, skills development will help ensure a smooth transition of workers between sectors and hopefully alleviate jobs losses. But it should be mentioned that we cannot upskill and retrain our way out of the 4IR challenges. Social protection floors have a key role to play in any skills development strategies, as a basic level of security provides a space to participate in skills development. As COVID-19 and 4IR are ongoing processes, there is also a need for timely data and monitoring to inform on policy impacts and redirections. Traditional data sources such as labor force surveys, household surveys, or administrative data are very comprehensive, but they also tend to be slow and unadapted to 4IR realities. These data sources can be augmented by real-time data from sources such as digital jobs platforms, social media, and other big data collected by firms. Enhanced partnerships with the private sector would allow APEC economies to monitor the interaction of 4IR and COVID-19 trends more closely and inform policy analysis even further. I will stop here and thank you, and I look forward to an interesting discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. San Andres. It's interesting that we started getting to have some answers to the questions posed by Mr. Pedrosa earlier already right now. So for example, I think we heard that the reason why people expect wages to drop that much from the previous presentation is that the physical restrictions on labor mobility can actually lead to lower employment, and this is what people expect. But I'm also glad that we got some answers on how exactly governments should prepare to the second wave or to any other crisis that might happen. And it's, of course, securing social nets and making this digitalization more human and putting more human perspective into post-industrial revolution. And actually, this is what I wanted to talk about next, is about how people live in among all of this digitalization, how people live in the urban places and spaces. So even before the COVID, with the ability to join work calls from home and from any place, really, I would imagine that the way we live in cities was already changing because there was no need for everyone to come to the office daily. But now with the COVID, for sure, the habits and patterns would change. We have today with us the representative of UN Habitat, Herman Pienaar, who is leading the urban lab and also the planning, finance, and economy section. And I know that the organization is working on the major study or report on the future of cities. So I wanted to hear from him. What does the rise of this remote work mean for the urban planning, and what we should expect from the COVID impact as well? Herman, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation and the very interesting discussions and presentations that are happening. Let me share my screen. I have a short presentation that I can do on the subject, and it's more about asking the questions, I think, about what will happen. I think no one really knows exactly what will the effect be for cities and for urban areas. So a lot of it is still speculative, trying to get an early trajectory of the trends or model what is possible in the future. And as previous speakers have indicated, a lot of it has happened because of the COVID crisis that has accelerated these things. So to a large extent, home from work in terms of US statistics have increased since 2005, up to 173%. So it's not a new trend. It's something that's been there pre-COVID. And the interesting thing is of people that are able to work remotely in the US, their earnings put them in the upper 80% of earners within the US. So I think it's also a global trend that people with the ability to work remotely are the upper income groups within areas. So it has a major impact also on who will dictate how cities will operate in the future. They also target mid-sized cities within the US, and if one translate that to a global trend, then it's more your second-tier cities that has the highest growth in terms of remote working within these cities. Now, came COVID, came 2020, and we have the largest work from home experiment the world has ever seen. And it seems like that experiment is actually working quite well in many cases. Although it has the negative side effects that have been mentioned before, but what it essentially did to the trend of the graph that had a steady incline and almost an unnoticeable effect on urban areas, although there's been an awareness of that, is suddenly there's this jump that's been forced by COVID, and suddenly there's the realization of companies that maybe thought that it's not possible. Now they had to make it possible, and suddenly the jump in terms of the various platforms, the technology advancements, start to make this really possible. Now the question really is, where will the trend go from here on? And depending also on a lot of variables in terms of to what extent will the COVID crisis continue over a length of time, and will there be a after COVID situation regarding pandemics and so forth. But it's likely that either the same sort of growth in the trend continues, or that it takes a bit of a dip to normalize again. Certainly remote work under the constraints of the COVID restrictions is different from people who would ultimately, after the restrictions are lifted, would say, I'm not completely working from home, but I may be able to work from home 60% of the time, and so forth. So it's a partial work from home. So we expect that trend would probably drop when things normalize a little bit. But then because of the advancement in technology and the experience that companies and people have gained in this period, would have the possibility of a sharp rise. Now, we accept that remote work is here to stay. It's not a passing trend, but what is the effect going to be on cities? And firstly, I'm looking at the impact at a more regional and territorial scale. There is this trend, a prediction that there will be an exodus from major urban centers, mainly pushed by cost of living and environmental factors within those cities. And this sort of levels the playing field at a city regional level, whereby smaller or second tier cities can now compete to attract these talents. And where in the past, the competition was really to bring in corporates into cities and into regions. Now that is still the case, that companies are being targeted, but the game has changed slightly in the sense that you're now targeting individuals, and you're targeting high-end individuals mostly to come into these cities, and it could result over a longer term period to a major redistribution of health to smaller cities that then would have the resulting benefits within their housing markets, their tax base, and their local economies, with, of course, the result of your large mega cities that could suffer as a result of that. So there's a trade-off at a regional level as well. But it seems that cities that are less expensive but are able to provide high quality environments and good services will attract people, and that the main services that this group of remote workers will be looking for would be broadband, transportation connections, health services, cultural and entertainment scenes, and then a focus on environment and sustainability are all things that would shift within that regional sense. At a broader scale, if one look at developing countries or cities that are economically marginalized and that have inadequate infrastructure for economic growth, they would still struggle even within a decentralized and a work from home kind of environment, because the key infrastructure required, like electricity networks and stable ICT networks, are still in a deficit at these countries. But what it enables them to do is to shift their priorities, and instead of, say, investing in a new highway, rather invest in the ICT network or a good electricity network to actually facilitate and get onto the wave of the new way of business being done. But it may actually result, even at a regional level, in some major inequalities of cities that are able to catch this wave of remote working, and the ones that will be left out of that. At a city impact scale, there are really three areas that I want to touch on. There are many variables that come into play, but as this remote work increase, I mean, there's some proponents that really say that the majority of work in the future will be done remotely in any event, and that has got a bearing on the property market. There's going to be less demand for office and commercial space. That has got the risk for major office centers to become defunct. There's a huge loss of income that as a result of that, and that there's the consensus that the average property values in major cities will decline, with these major urban centers being carrying the greatest brunt of the decline. Residential properties on the fringe of the cities in the suburbs may in fact have an increase in pricing, because people will say, well, I don't have to live so close to work anymore. I can live in better environments. And it may in fact push again for a more sprawling kind of development that would have negative consequences environmentally as well. So it's going to be important that cities and governments manage and have a good handle on what the market shifts will be within cities itself. I think one of the greatest impacts that are being felt immediately is that all the shops, restaurants, businesses that are dependent on, let's call it lunch hour traffic or straight after work buying power, are in steep decline. And a way to start to combat that would really be to say, how do one make use of the latent space, business space, and convert that and transform that into residential, bring people back into those areas on more of a 24-hour basis to supplement the activity that used to be there because of business. That will also have a marked income on city income and cities' ability to provide services to its citizens. Smaller cities that gain from remote work, they of course would have an increase, but the major urban centers may have to deal with a decline, and that would necessitate that there are better management of urban growth within the areas, making sure that there's better reuse of existing spaces than just the creation of new city extensions, especially to make sure that one pick up on the latent capacity of infrastructure and buildings that would be left because of an out-migration. And for cities to focus really on quality living environments to retain some of that income. Now, this trend of to what extent cities will be left with latent space is really dependent on how many people would really become digital nomads, or people that are totally footloose and can work anywhere. If the trend is going to be more that it's a part-time work away at home, then people would still have to be in close proximity to their work to some extent to be able to travel. On the infrastructure side of what do cities concentrate on? And I think especially for that second tier city group, the importance of good ICT infrastructure has become paramount if you want to attract economic growth and if you want to attract these high value individuals to your area. Then ICT infrastructure is a no-brainer. That would be key, and to go with that would be the stable power networks. The difference for these cities are that in the past, where they could concentrate their networks where the most economic activity was taking place, they now have to provide the same level of service and power security over a wider area that may put some strain on the network, and where they need to invest more. Cities that has gone on smart city strategies definitely has an advantage in this environment for obvious reasons. And then the last infrastructure area I want to cover is around transportation and movement. Certainly traffic congestion will drop within cities the more people work from home or remotely. And that obviously have a positive effect to dropping the pollution levels, but it also has a marked effect on the public transportation. In some cases, it will ease the oversubscribed services and so that they can cope better, but it also will have a negative impact on the cost effectiveness and the income of those services. So cities need to start to look at how to manage these different infrastructure levels. I'm just mentioning really a few of them, but overall it's going to call for smarter investment and being able to control where and how development happens within the city better in the future to be able to survive. Just in conclusion, then to say that the opportunities for cities and for regions as such are both positive and negative depending on which side of the equation you are. If you're a net loss in terms of high value people, or a net gain in terms of high value people, but ultimately it will give a more balanced regional layout of the economy than what was previously the case. So in that sense, it is also positive. It could also provide higher levels of inclusion women and differently able people, understanding that there are certain issues, as mentioned by the previous speaker, that has got negative effects for those groupings as well. But ultimately, the spectrum of employment would increase. There's also the risk of widening the poverty gap. As I indicated, that the people who are able to work remotely are usually in the top income brackets, and the lower income brackets may be trapped into having to go to work, having to have the transportation cost, and paying premiums to stay closer to work as well. And that may in fact widen the poverty gap within cities and also across regions. The cities that will have the most gain from this are the ones that can provide the supporting infrastructure for this new economic trend, and really to repurpose defunct spaces and spaces that have been left open, and to create a better mix of use to actually balance out the amount of people and business activity that are taking place within a particular area. In our view, if one look at all the principles for sustainable and resilient development, those would still really apply, and cities that have gone on that trend are coping better with the COVID crisis in any event, and those are the cities that will also come out top in terms of the remote working situation as well. So with that, it's just a few thoughts to help with the debate. We really don't have all the answers at this stage, and we will have to keep a close eye on how this trend will change cities over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Herman. I think no one have answers today, but you definitely have a lot of fundamental data and fundamental food for thought already for us to think more about not only the cities, but also about the people and the citizens. And I think you just supported again the statement made previously by Emanuels and Andres that upskilling is hugely important, and helping people to adapt to this new reality is hugely important, as before people who already had the digital skills were in the upper 80% of those making money, and probably this is where governments can step in. But also you gave us some hope, I think, mentioning that now developing countries can potentially leapfrog with this new digitalization and remote work trends, and potentially their smaller cities also can leapfrog in their development and get more chances comparing to what they used to have before. Which is very interesting and very topical for Russia, for example, where in Moscow is concentrated. Moscow is a concentration of most corporations and most businesses, and I wonder if this exodus, as you mentioned, is going to happen in Russia, and if population is really going to move to smaller cities, and what would it mean for us, for our property cost and our traffic in Moscow. We have with us today Tatiana Politi, who is the Executive Director for Institute of Urban Economy, and I hope she can shed more light on what exactly these global trends that Herman was talking about would mean for Russian urban planning, and what should we all expect. Tatiana, the floor is yours.
Many thanks. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to say a bit about the Russian metropolitan areas. So my presentation, do you see it?
Yes, we see it.
But not at full screen, yes?
Not full screen yet. I think you can go to slideshow.
Just a second. What a problem. I don't understand.
Slideshow, yeah, should be it. Perfect, we see it.
Okay, so I would like to highlight two key points. It's economic structure and urban spatial models in the Russian metropolitan areas, in the Russian major metropolitan areas. considering the current COVID situation. So we define actually 3 types of economic structure for the Russian metropolitan areas. Today, I would say about the major Russian metropolitan areas with population over 1 million people. So we have roughly 3 types. It's metropolitan areas with modern urban economy, metropolitan areas with the resource economy, and ones with the industrial economy. So the first type is agglomerations with a relatively high level of high share of service sectors as personal consumer services and business services as well. The economy of this type of agglomerations is highly diversified and modern and so on and so forth. And 2 another types of agglomerations are characterized by more traditional economic structure. The first type is resource economy, and the second type is industrial economy. And you may see on this picture, on this slide, the average structure of the gross metropolitan product, GMP. We say it's like GDP, but for metropolitan areas of the above 3 types. As you can see, while for the first type of the metropolitan areas, we have the relatively high share of finance, real estate, IT, and other business services, about 30%. It's significantly higher than in the GDP structure for Russian Federation. And the personal consumer services, about 20%, while you can see opposite picture for the resource metropolitan areas and industrial economic metropolitan areas, where public administration and safety or social services financed by budgetary finance prevail. So what consequences of this situation we have considering the current COVID situation? The losses of GMP, differs for these metropolitan areas, and we can observe so-called trap of well-developed urban economy, because the most developed metropolitan areas are the least sustainable at the moment, are the least sustainable to the urgent economic restrictions, which were introduced in March and April in Russia. That was a period of the most stringent restrictions when the substantial part of the urban economy were stopped. As you can see on this slide, as a whole, as the Institute for Urban Economics estimated it, about 56% of the economy of the most developed Russian metropolitan areas was stopped, while only 33% of GMP was stopped for the resource metropolitan areas and 44% for the industrial metropolitan areas. This is the consequence of the structure of the economy of these metropolitan areas, because the relatively high share of services, as I mentioned, either personal consumer services or business services, brings about the more losses of GMP, because these sectors didn't able to switch fastly to remote work. Of course, in the midterm or in the long term, these sectors will adopt. But at the moment, and I guess that in 2020, these agglomerations lost the most part of, not most part, the highest share of their GDP. But as I mentioned, they could adapt faster through the expansion of distant work models. And what about urban spatial development of the Russian metropolitan areas? The spatial development models here differ substantially from the most well-developed megapolises in many countries, because suburbs of the Russian metropolitan areas, the major ones, as I mentioned, are highly dense, and they are built up by multi-story apartment buildings, and we have a huge everyday traffic induces the pandemic risks, as well as worsens the ecology and the quality of urban life as a whole. So to my mind, the COVID distress could encourage more rational urban development in Russia through lowering the demand for such a commuting model. And maybe we'll have some new stimulus for more rational urban development. I mean, low dense single family development on the suburbs. And meanwhile, this could encourage a new demand for the second home for the city residents, which is now relatively low for many of cities. And the key challenge here is, the challenge of the shift to the remote working for the biggest metropolitan areas is restructuring, as Herman mentioned already, is restructuring the demand on the city commercial real estate and the city land as a whole. So the new forms, new uses for this real estate and this land should be found. But of course, it depends on the economic restructuring as well, because in the current economic structure, it is, I guess, that it is a difficult problem to restructure in short term, restructure the use of real estate and the use of land in the city centers, especially in Moscow. And it could bring about the crisis or something like crisis in real estate market and drop in the real estate prices and rents. So there is a big uncertainty here how the economy would react for these price signals. So I think that my time is finished, and I could answer some questions because, of course, I had too small time for observe substantially all these issues.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tatiana. So, by the way, all of the audience, you're welcome to post any questions in the chat to any of the speakers and speakers between yourselves too as well. I'm not too sure we'll have enough time to have a big discussion in the end, but hopefully we'll take a few questions from the floor. And yeah, so Tatiana, you mentioned very interesting trends that apparently there is juxtaposition of the measures taken to take care of the health of the citizens and measures taken to protect the economy. Because in the cities where in Russia we were able to impose some very strict measures, actually the economy dropped most just because these measures were implemented. So it's a very interesting balance that governments apparently should find. But apparently the remote work is going to stay with us and change the demand in the real estate market and even restructure the market. And I wanted to talk more about the actual topical question of our today's roundtable is remote work itself. So apparently it's going to stay with us even after the COVID. Herman was presenting two or three potential trends that might be happening is that remote work will stay high or remote work will stay in some form with us. I wonder if we already have any more evidence of the effectiveness of the remote work, and in economic terms, does it mean that people are being more effective on remote work, or people are being as effective, less effective, and what it means for businesses? So we have today with us Andrea Garnero from OECD, who I know gathered some evidence from the OECD countries on this and probably can give some predictions and shed some light on these questions. Andrea, I think you're with us. The floor is yours.
Yes, thanks a lot. I think you can hear me now. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I prepared a few slides mainly to show you few numbers. It's often much easier to show you the numbers instead of showing and talking for a long time. Let me see if now I think you can see full slides, no?
Yeah, we can see it.
Excellent. So my question is like indeed what you ask is this a paradigm shift we experienced across the globe, really not even in most countries, but really across the globe, a major paradigm shift all of a sudden in few days in March, April, when the pandemic started to diffuse across the globe. And that was a major shift from what we had before. So here there are some numbers for EU 28 countries, and you see that before COVID-19, this is 2018, usually across European countries between 1 and very maximum 9-8% of workers were usually working from home in 2018. A larger share of workers work from home every now and then, the green bars, but you see that working from home was relatively limited and for the majority of workers, except maybe in few Nordic countries here on the left, like the Netherlands, Sweden, Iceland, or Luxembourg. What happened during COVID? Let's say there was a major increase in telework, but what do we know about the impact of remote work? So the evidence we have for the time being is about the pre-COVID situation. So it's certainly a very different situation where people chose to be working from home, had the opportunity to decide, or in some cases they had family commitments and decided to work from home for that reason. Nevertheless, what we know is that there is a positive effect on well-being and job satisfaction. Here are some references. I can give you the full reference later on if you want. But there were also some risk of loneliness were highlighted by some scholars, because after a while people feel disconnected from their colleagues and the rest of the company, and they're also less happy if telework is associated to significant wage cuts. On productivity, which is certainly a key issue, there is somewhat mixed evidence. We have evidence from China, from Nick Bloom and co-authors, and Italy from two professors in Bocconi, where they find a positive effect on productivity. But there are also other papers that find either an let's say non-significant effect or a negative effect on productivity. So this is what we knew before COVID, when telework was limited to few companies and workers. When COVID hit, here you can find the results of a survey for a dozen OECD countries by a group of scholars, international scholars in Europe. And you can see that the share of people working from home raised spectacularly. So you remember before there were between 1 and 8% of workers working from home, and here you can see that the percentage goes from around 30% of workers working from home in April, mid-April 2020, to about 60% in New Zealand, with significant variation across countries, but still big numbers across the countries that we have in the South Pole. However, what we have to keep in mind, and that's an important issue also for the future, how we see the remote work from now on, is that not all workers can work from home. Let's say to work from home, basically you need to be able to work on a laptop or to do very specific tasks that do not require physical interaction. So any job that requires some sort of physical interactions with colleagues, machines, or customers cannot be done properly for a long time from home. And you can see here, it's the same chart as before, but here we split between income quartiles. So on the left, you can see the bottom quartile, let's say the workers earning less. On the right, you can see the top quartile, the workers earning the most. And you can see that there is a significant difference in the share of people working from home. So if in Australia, only 40% of workers in the first quartile work from home, more than 60% of workers in the top quartile work from home. This is implications also in terms of the number of people who stop working. So the green bars, here you can see that the numbers of people who stopped working during the COVID crisis in April was much higher among the bottom quartile than in the top quartile in terms of labor income. So the issue with telework is that it's a great opportunity. It has great opportunities in terms of strengthening the resilience of our labor market. So those who were able to work from home were able to continue working despite the pandemic. That was not the case for other occupations and companies and workers, but also can improve work-life balance. In some cases, it can improve productivity, but that's not something that any worker and any company can do. And this we have, I think, to keep in mind. So if we look forward, what can we say? Of course, it's very difficult to make predictions. And I'm not here to make forecasts on the exact development of remote work. Certainly, I believe personally that remote work is indeed here to stay, certainly much more than that was the case before. We have no hard evidence to support this claim. However, there is a survey, an interesting survey of American companies by the US Bureau of Labor Statistics that shows that companies are planning to use remote work for about 20% of the time. And this is a fourfold increase compared to the pre-COVID situation. So it's a decrease compared to the peak of the pandemic, but it's still an increase, a fourfold increase compared to the pre-COVID time. So that's a major and significant increase. It means basically 2 days per, or 1 day per week on average, but could go up. So 1 day per week of working from home. The issue is that this is connected to a change in the way work is organized and management is organized. Because you need new forms of management. Basically, you need an effective performance review system where you review the work of the workers based on their objectives and having reached or not these objectives, and not measuring the performance for with these workers being at the office, sitting on the chair between 9 and 6 or 8 and 5, whatever you want. A risk, especially for workers, is that there is no disconnect between work and personal life anymore. So we are always connected. There is no even physical distance between what is the place of work and what is where we live and where we live with our families and so on. So there is a risk of being permanently connected with all, let's say, personal and psychological issues that this may raise. And finally, an important issue in many OECD countries is the role of social partners, so unions and employees organizations, so what role they can play in regulate the use of telework or remote work instead of the role of the law. So you can regulate telework by setting unique standards across the country, or leaving this to social partners to define this sector by sector or company by company, depending on the national traditions and practices. What will be the long run effect on productivity? Difficult to say. Many people say that we're going to lose the random interactions where new ideas are created, at the water cooler, at the coffee machine. To be fully honest, there's no real hard evidence of the water cooler effect. Let's say there's no hard evidence that there is massive patenting when taking a coffee in the break in the morning or in the afternoon. But certainly there could be an impact on innovation. An easy thing to do in the coming months and years is to monitor the number of patents. Of course, this is not easy, but certainly it's an easy proxy to see whether this could have an effect on innovation and hence productivity and let's say the wealth of our countries at the bottom, but to monitor the number of patents. As I was saying before, not everyone can telework. So there is a risk of segregation, and in particular for women, if telework is used to, let's say, to segregate and to push out of the company some workers that either we don't like, or a group of workers that is has somewhat weaker attachment and for different reasons, usually family reasons, may prefer to work from home and lose all what is happening in the office in terms of discussions, chats, but also connections and possibilities of career. So this is an issue that we should keep in mind very carefully. I will not develop the issues of cities because this has been discussed very thoroughly in the previous session. However, I just add that it's not just an issue of commuting, density and environment, but it's also an issue of what kind of jobs. So you may know the work by Enrico Moretti of the number of jobs that are created thanks to high-tech, high-skilled jobs, and all the service jobs that come in, let's say, low-skilled service jobs, so also medium, high-skilled service jobs that come as a personal services to engineers and other people in the Silicon Valley. If we don't go to the office anymore, we will not eat our sandwich at lunch out anymore. We'll not go maybe for a few errands during the lunch break around the office anymore. So this will have an impact on the labor market as well. And we already see it. You may have seen the news in the UK of the food chain Pret-a-Manger that is closing down many shops and many thousand jobs that are being lost because of this. So this is an issue. And finally, the last point, and a somewhat unforeseen and undiscussed risk, is that telework may pave the way to the automation of high-skilled work too. Usually we are used to discuss automation and offshoring of jobs in terms of low-skilled jobs. So usually in OECD countries, we fear the fact that, for instance, some low-skilled, more or less routine jobs can either be done by machines, robots, or be outsourced to China, Vietnam, or Morocco, for instance. But if we all work through a laptop, then we can simply automate high-skilled jobs too, or have telemigrants, as Richard Baldwin wrote in a book before COVID. So basically you can have engineers working in Bangalore, in India, or in other countries in the world for a company that is based in London, Paris, or New York. And so this is another issue linked to telework that is not often discussed, but this could, let's say, put some pressure on high-skilled workers too. So with all this, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much for this. I'm glad that we tend to mention very similar statistics and trends, despite we're talking about different markets, and both for the percentage of people who worked remotely during the COVID and percentage of time we are going to spend in the office after the COVID is over. And apparently, yes, telework is here with us to stay. And it's very worrying that you mentioned that we should look not only at the most vulnerable parts of the population, which we already talked about, that we need to reskill them and probably work harder to include them into the workforce, but also about high-skilled professionals. I think this is something that we should consider and take into our policies. But anyways, as we all agree that telework is here with us to stay, probably it's high time we all made sure that we're doing it the right way. And I know International Labour Organization has published actually a guide on the practical teleworking and how it should be done correctly and how businesses and governments should facilitate it. And if I'm not mistaken, it was even translated into Russian and published recently. So without further ado, I'd like John Messenger to take us through the key takeaways of the practical guide on teleworking and make sure we're all doing it right. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Margarita. I don't have a presentation. I'm going to try to keep my remarks short because I think we're running short on time. So I'm going to try to be as concise as I can. Actually, I'm teleworking as I have been for 6 months from my house in rural France, 40 kilometers from Geneva. And I have to say it's been quite an adaptation and reminding me of the differences in infrastructure and how the differences in the digital infrastructure affect one's ability to telework effectively, something I also talk about in the guide. But basically, this is something I've been doing for a very long time. I started doing research and also doing telework when I was working at the US Department of Labor in Washington back in the 1990s. I've been working on this issue along with other issues relating to working time and work organization, which is my area. So I deal with all of these issues as a form of flexible work arrangement. And as everyone has said, this is something that hasn't been really widespread, despite the fact it should have been widespread prior to the pandemic. And I had a book, ironically, that came out, Telework in the 21st Century, an Evolutionary Perspective, where I talk about the evolution of telework from its origins in the state of California, yes, in the 1970s, if you can believe it, the mid-1970s, when a fellow named Jack Niles, who used to work at NASA, so this guy is pretty far out there, I mean, came up with this idea, literally came up with this idea of substituting commuting with telecommunications, you know? So it's basically commuting by means of telecommunications, hence telecommuting, which eventually became generalized to teleworking in some of the later publications that Niles did. So I follow that all the way through. This book came out at the end of November, and I have to tell you, the response was silence. Silence, and it came out at the end of November. Silence in December, no one was interested. January, almost no one interested. February, hardly anyone cared. In March, all of a sudden, everyone was interested. It exploded from nowhere, literally within days. You know, and I had always been doing telework, and I actually had a regular teleworking arrangement, and all of a sudden, I seemed to be the one who seemed to know everything, which of course I don't. But the bottom line is people saw my book, realized it. I ended up doing a video for our communications department. It was well received. Then I was inundated with requests. I was sending out stuff as best as I could, information from my book and other information I've been working on. I have to say, it was overwhelming. It was absolutely an overwhelming situation. So what I realized I had to do, because I couldn't treat all the demands from the whole world all by myself, with my one other colleague who's a labor lawyer who works on my team. And I have one other statistician, and that's my whole small team. So there's no way I could handle all these requests from all over the world. So I decided to sit down and put together this guide. Actually, I collaborated with a couple of consultants from a consulting firm in Brussels called the Work Life Hub. They've been working on this issue too, extensively as well. So we put this thing together in a few months very intensively and got it out in July. And as Margarita said, it's been translated into Russian. It's also been translated into Italian, French, and the Spanish version should be out shortly as well. Basically, that's where it is. I don't really have time to go into all the details. I just want to tell you basically what the key bits are, and then I want to answer the questions that Margarita had posed to me, which was, I'm at other 3 key recommendations, right? You still want me to hit those, right?
Yes, surely, please.
Okay, so basically, I talk about what happened, how telework exploded during the pandemic, its use as a crisis response measure, and then I go into 8 focal areas, all of which are really critical for making telework work effectively. Working time and work organization, performance management, which we've already heard a little bit about from our colleague at the OECD. I couldn't agree with what he said more about results-based management. He's 100.0% correct, and you can't be more correct than that. Then you have the issues of digitalization, which I have faced coming out here. Connectivity in Geneva, I had an apartment in Geneva up until July. My connectivity was perfect. Fiber optic cable, instantaneous connections, I could do anything. It was just as good as working in the office. I come out to rural France, 40 kilometers from Geneva, and I'm struggling. Even with this, I wasn't even sure if I'd have video today. I mean, because also we're having work on our network. They're trying to upgrade it, but at the same time, we're also trying to use it, and it's a challenge. So you've also got digitalization, communications issues, very, very key, very difficult to maintain remote communications. And to manage a remote team is a very, very difficult thing. But if you know how to do it well, I think it can be very effective. Also, you've got issues of OSH, occupational safety and health. Everyone thinks about ergonomic issues, but with full-time teleworking, you've also got the potential for isolation. And that's a really big issue. This is why most of the studies that have been done, including my own book and a previous study I did with Eurofound in Dublin, have said, hey, that's not the way to go. Full-time telework isn't the way. Part-time telework, part-time in the office, and then part-time to maintain your links with the organization and colleagues, and part-time outside the office. This is the ideal, this is the sweet spot, the ideal model. You've also got legal and contractual implications, training, which is critical. We were all thrown in the deep end. I knew what I was doing, but a lot of my colleagues didn't. And we went from a test of telework on Thursday to full-time telework the following Tuesday. And it was like getting thrown into the deep end of the pool and not knowing how to swim. You either have to swim or you're going to sink to the bottom and drown. So this is not how you should do it. You need training for both teleworkers and also for their managers. And then finally, work-life balance. And I think the key there to work-life balance is what we call time sovereignty, which is another of my issues. You let workers manage their own working time. That's what it means. You manage them by objective. You have clearly established objectives. Again, like the colleague from OECD said, clear results-based framework, and then let them figure out how to do it. You know, I mean, micromanaging teleworkers happened a lot during the pandemic. I mean, that's an issue I'd like to investigate more afterwards, but I'm telling you, it's the key. If you want this to work right, you manage by results and you allow teleworkers to manage their own working hours. You don't try to micromanage them and check when they're online and when they're not online, or install an electronic camera so that they can focus all their attention on whether they're being watched and what the manager might be seeing rather than actually doing the work. Okay. Or impose reporting requirements that are so heavy that teleworkers spend an hour or two every single day doing reporting. And they say, hey, how am I supposed to get my job done? I mean, I spend all my time on reporting. So we're covering all these issues. We also covered the gender dimension of teleworking, which we also heard about earlier in this webinar. That's a key issue.
Okay, John, so really sorry to cut you short, but I know that some speakers...
Yeah, you're running out of time. Okay. Okay, so shall I shoot then right for the recommendations?
I think you already kind of mentioned them.
No, I didn't focus on, can I hit my 3 main recommendations? Okay, you said mainly for government. Infrastructure is key. You have to have adequate infrastructure, otherwise it doesn't work. Communications infrastructure, digital infrastructure is essential. The second thing is you need a legal and regulatory framework. I mean, you can't just have this be, laissez-faire, everybody do whatever they want. You need a framework, a legal and regulatory framework, but it needs to be a flexible framework as well. A good example is the European Framework Agreement on telework, established way back in 2002. The Autonomous Social Partner Agreement in the EU, which has worked very, very well for almost 20 years. I mean, so it shows that it's something that employers and workers can agree on. And the last thing, which is the hardest, which is the reason I think this is a breakthrough, management. You have to change management mindset. There could have been a lot more telework prior to the pandemic than there actually was. The reason there wasn't was because of organizational and managerial resistance. They feared loss of control. And you need to address that. And the way you address that is by having a results-based approach and then allowing workers to do it, the way that makes most sense to them to hit their targets. That's the hardest part. But that's the one positive thing I can think of COVID. It broke through that managerial resistance by forcing people to try it. And they realized that even though they didn't do it very well, it actually worked pretty well, which is a miracle considering that it was done very poorly, at least initially. So those are the takeaways I would leave you with there, Margarita.
Thank you very much, John. And I would encourage everyone to actually read the teleguide, as we definitely cut John short. But today with us, we actually have someone who has been doing teleworking way before it was mainstream, and someone who can probably share some best management practices. Uliana Zinina, who is the head of public policy of Facebook. Uliana, I know that you have to run to the next meeting. If you can just spend a few more minutes with us to share what Facebook is doing right now and planning to do.
Thank you so much, Margarita. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Cool. Again, thank you so much. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Thank you for having me and giving me an opportunity to share with you some lessons that Facebook learned during moving our work from offices to home, basically. So as we already heard earlier during our meeting, COVID-19 has brought great challenges. Supporting employees, managing disruption, pivoting business models. For many companies, including Facebook, it has catapulted them and us 5 years into the future. And as Eduardo mentioned earlier this meeting, we were on track to moving digital, but COVID helped to move us faster than we even predicted. And not just in a way we work, but in a way that we engage with employees, with how we communicate with customers, how we even operate our businesses. And what we learned since COVID lockdown, that remote work works. And in some cases, companies even believe that their culture improved as they work harder than ever to look after their people, to support them, to overcome their people's unprecedented struggles. So as I think majority of us would say, we've been under unprecedented pressure since spring. At Facebook, we are shifting to remote work ourselves. Many people can now choose where they do their work best, while we continue to lay the technical foundation for a more flexible and more fair work for all of us. Some times ago, we asked our employees about their experiences working from home. And no surprises was that many, more than half of them said they are at least as productive as they are in the office. About 40% of them are interested in full-time remote work. Of the people who want to work remotely, around 75% said they might move to another place within the country they are living, or maybe moving to another country. And our vision is to be the most forward-leaning company on remote work at our scale. And our ambitions that Mark shared a few months back is to have up to 50% of our workforce working remotely within 5 years. And of course, there are clear benefits of working from home that we already also been discussing during this meeting. The most visible, the most interesting and important benefit from that remote work lets us access talent pools outside of traditional hubs in big cities. And that helps us to spread economic opportunity much more widely around the world, while also helping to build more diverse company. By hiring from a broader pool of candidates, we continue to hire the best talent wherever they are located. And by expanding our access to global talent pools, we can attract new talents and increase diversity of our team and basically of our company and community we serve. And now one benefit, and that has been already mentioned by Herman, is remote work is better for environment because of reduced commuting. We also found out that many people feel more productive, as I mentioned, more productive outside of offices. And furthermore, it would help us to serve our community better while working from home. For Facebook specifically, remote work setup help to advance some of future technologies we are developing. So much of what we build and been building so far is around helping people feel connected and present with others, no matter where we are. Like our messaging apps, like Facebook and Instagram, our video chats, our workplace, and our hardware, like Portal. Eventually, our AR and VR technologies, everything is helping us to support our employees and our customers on a remote work basis at scale, because we build products and services that connect people, and this is basically our mission. But and I will briefly maybe touch upon on not very positive things, because not everything is positive. We found out that having kids home from schools is very tough for parents and people living on their own that have struggles to cope with COVID and lockdown. And to address that, Facebook implemented wide programs of supporting parents and providing them with additional leave programs, additional well-being support. Over time, we also realized how hard it can be to find the right work-life balance without clear boundary between work and home. And I can say for myself that as John just mentioned, that it's really challenging to stop working, especially when you're sitting all day long at your computer. And we introduced some limitations and rules internally to encourage people to focus on their off-work hours. We provide flexibility to everybody, as it became a key in a building of future and flexible and working environment for all of us. Our employees are allowed to design a personal approach to flexibility that helps them to do their best work and also support the health and support the health of their family around. We want everyone at Facebook to take care basically of their health, of their family, their personal priorities, while still having meaningful impact at work. As Emmanuel mentioned earlier, we indeed focus on putting people first and putting their well-being first. Cautious about time, as I mentioned, next 5-10 years, we think we could have 50% of our people working remotely, but we are going to get there in a measured way. Of course, following over studies that we already heard about during this meeting, or any other studies that are coming. And as the technology improves, the number of jobs that can be done fully remotely will likely increase across the rest of the economy too. And you, Margarita, also mentioned about Russia that, and I couldn't agree more, that in such huge country like Russia, with its incredible level of talents living in a very remote areas, these developments triggered by COVID could give an important impulse for accepting the concept that location is less of a factor in how many people work, and we will have a technology to feel truly present no matter where we are. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Uliana. So it looks like we have some answers to the question mentioned before by Andreas, that are people really being more productive, or at least as productive during teleworking? And Facebook study shows that yes, 50% report that they're as productive. So hopefully this doesn't impact our economy in a bad way. And I also wanted to highlight your thought about personal approach to flexibility. So today's roundtable is not named just teleworking. It means it's named new flexible work arrangements, which means exactly this, that it's not only teleworking all the time, it's maybe teleworking sometimes, it's taking your flexible hours when you want to work. And I wonder what it means overall for the digital sphere in our economy, as Facebook has definitely been the pioneer of digital products, but not only. And I wanted to ask Rajiv Mantri to share some thoughts on what it would mean on the global level. Rajiv, the floor is yours. And sorry for waiting.
So I'll just touch upon how the wave of digital products and services are changing actually how people work, how people collaborate. And I think this will have some incredible results for innovation and productivity in the coming years. So let's back up a little bit and talk about what is a job. So this tweet was put out by Michael Arrington. Michael is a well-known investor, and he was the founder of TechCrunch. So he narrated this story of how somebody he knew of in Silicon Valley was working 2 jobs at 2 global tech giants without the tech giants knowing that this person is working 2 jobs. So actually this tells you in a way, if employees all go remote, then how do companies know who else they may or may not be working for? And not just that, it also tells you that if a person can actually hold on 2 jobs simultaneously, were they really working full time to begin with? So what was the productivity aspect when it comes to being employed full time, as we called it, or as we do still call it? I think as we are transitioning into a world where more and more companies are thinking of telecommuting or teleworking, and in fact some of the larger tech players have already said that they will persist with this policy well beyond the pandemic. I think the nature of the what we call a job itself is going to change very dramatically. And connected with that is the nature of collaboration. So when we go into work in the kind of old world, a lot of things were done in a physical sense on pieces of paper, or meeting in person and things like that. But now each of those interactions, each of those kind of modes that enabled work to happen, each of them are getting kind of softwareized or digitalized. So whether it is messaging, voice and video communications, kind of scheduling and calendaring. So instead of having like a person who would build out your calendar or schedule, there are tools now which do that for you, for example. And then there is obviously task management, data collaboration, knowledge sort of sharing. All kinds of softwares are available, and this is in fact one of the most fast growing areas for investment. The beauty of this is these tools can be used whether one is in the same company or in the same city or even across the world. Even the way we are holding this particular session right now, it is using obviously the Zoom platform, and now it is second nature for people almost to be using platforms like Zoom, but it was not the case maybe a year or 2 ago. So the emergence of this array of collaboration tools is really changing the way people work, and it is enabling new kinds of work to happen. So what is the impact that technology is going to have in all of this? I think that technology will enable better matching between the skills that people have and the needs that different economies have on a global basis. And the interesting thing about this is that a lot of barriers fall away when you kind of virtualize and digitalize these activities. So for example, countries can place immigration caps, right? So work visas and things like that, they can be capped, because if you need to bring somebody in across a physical border, a government can control that. But what a government can't control is a company hiring somebody and having them work remotely or virtually. I think this is also going to enable better asset utilization, so to say, of human resources. So we go back to the example of the person who is working 2 jobs at tech companies. Clearly, their productivity was not being fully harnessed, and now it is being harnessed. And the other, I think, most dramatic effect of virtualization would be that it would enable trade in new kinds of trade and services. So I think we are still in the early stages of this, whereby trade and services is conventionally thought of as a back office sort of offshoring and those kind of things. But soon I think we will see more and more important knowledge work being traded, and there are some examples of this happening in countries like India, Southeast Asia, even China, where large companies have important R&D centers, engineering research centers, and so on. And finally, automation is improving productivity. So because of the flexible nature of work now, people are using more kinds of software tools, digital tools, and somewhere it is improving productivity, in not just in a knowledge work sense, but even in a physical sense. So if you see the way, for example, e-commerce warehouses are run nowadays, there is a kind of combination of human plus machine. So when we are buying things online, when things are delivered in certain cities, companies like Amazon are delivering things on a 2-hour notice. So how does that supply chain work? It has a lot of automation built into it. There are actually machines and robots which are sorting, packing, and kind of helping or assisting human effort in those warehouses, in those kind of fulfillment centers, to deliver those packages at that scale, at that speed, and on that kind of a timeline. So all put together, these 3 or 4 effects are really going to change not just the physical world, but even aspects of manufacturing, even aspects of the way hardware works. So to close really quickly, what will be the economic effects? So I had referred to immigration and human capital. So in recent years, immigration has obviously been like a lightning rod issue in many countries, and there is a pushback because there is a perception that those who are coming in as economic immigrants are taking away the local jobs and so on. But soon I think we are heading into a world where immigration may only be required for an increasingly small section of work types, and many kinds of work will be possible to be done entirely virtually. So while it is important to be in the office and form certain types of social connects and bond together as a team and so on, the paradigm may be flipped, where instead of spending, let's say, 80% of time or 90% of time together in an office and then having offsites, it would be more like the team is globally distributed and there are occasional sort of meetups. And there are already companies which are implementing such models. One very prominent one from the internet space is a company called WordPress, which has a workforce that is entirely globally distributed, and this company doesn't even have an office. So I think that will have a very major impact on the immigration sort of questions that come around economic policy and human capital flows. I think the second compact that is going to break down is the industrial era compact of labor and capital. So labor and capital kind of being viewed perennially as being in conflict with each other. In the new kind of era, I think labor is capital. That's how it needs to be thought of, because what a person's skills and knowledge base is, that actually contributes to creation of output. And it's not just a machine, but like a skilled individual herself or himself is actually the creator of output. And finally, on a particular economic effect, it is not a direct economic effect, but probably a second order one, is the concept of price stickiness. So price stickiness is essentially, when prices don't change very fast, or in the earlier era, prices did not adapt very fast because there was a certain cost attached to kind of redoing the prices. But now what happens is, when you're shopping online, when you're even, let's say, looking for freelance help on, let's say, some of these flexible labor platforms, the prices are dynamic. It's determined by demand and supply. So even labor is going to be priced in a more dynamic way than earlier. and even goods and services will be priced in a more dynamic way than earlier. And all this comes eventually from the flexible nature of work, where labor and capital are kind of becoming fused in a way. So I'll close on that note.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rajiv. The first example that you shared on the person working simultaneously at Google and Facebook is really a shocking one, because in my previous life before ministry, I used to work on Google, and I know that you're fired on a day one once your employer knows you have another work arrangement like this. But this just highlights the point that John Messenger was mentioned before, that you actually need now to make sure that your employees are interested in the projects that they're doing and they're passionate about it, because there is no way that you can control what exactly they're doing on every minute. Anyways, I think one of the main economic effects that you mentioned is the flow of the human capital and the importance of the seamlessness and borderlessness of the human capital flow between the countries. And this definitely calls for closer collaboration between governments and making us sure that we don't only take governmental measures, but also do something on the global governance level. But anyways, it all calls for the greater collaboration, and collaboration is one of the, apps market that is growing. I wonder if we can continue talking about the digital sphere and how other digital products, maybe other than collaboration, or is it exactly collaborations that are growing right now with the COVID, and what we should expect in the field of the new digital apps, venture capital, startups, etc., etc. So we have Dmitry Politov with us, Senior VP of Web Ventures, which is providing venture capital to Russian startups. I wonder if we can get some knowledge on this sphere.
Yeah, thank you, Margarita. It's a pleasure, as always. It's fun to be the last person speaking, because mostly everything has been said before you appear on screen. So what I could do is I could usurp your role and try to sum up, but I've actually tried to put something new into the discussion. The venture capital industry is a peculiar industry because it's an industry where people come to risk their money. It's a sort of a betting enterprise when you have to think and consider if a project is going to be successful in the long run or not. And obviously, we've seen a lot of changes here in this industry over the past 9 months, almost 10, soon 10 now. Obviously, the whole COVID thing urged us to reevaluate the future of business. And meaning that if we reevaluate the future of business, we also reconsider the projects that we are investing in. And venture funds are supposed to have a vision of the future. So now we have to reevaluate it either way, even though most of the solutions were in the market even before, like the Zoom that we're using right now, has been available for quite some time. And during the time the COVID has been around us, it has gained almost, has grown more than 6 times, basically. So its market cap is now 6 times more than it was in January. And this is a very good notion of what is happening in the real market, in the market economy. But obviously, most of the funds are not going to be as aggressive. So the investments that happen like that are mostly reactive. And technically, venture capital funds are working in a domain of uncertainty. So what we face is a necessity to evaluate our risks with each and every investment that we make. And therefore, the changed circumstances are urging us to be more careful with what we're doing. And this is a trend that we're seeing universally. Interestingly, though, there are private equity funds, you know, many of them, like the Russian Direct Investment Fund, for example, the larger investment funds, and also a function that we sometimes exercise ourselves. These funds are not seeing any difficulties. And there's been a very nice case just recently with the Swedish fund that has raised almost, it has raised more than 6 billion euros, actually over the duration of 6 months, despite the fact that the economy is facing certain challenges. A great interest towards funds that are able to invest with a reliable return. Rate of return is very important right now because as the economies are not working very efficiently, people still want to get higher returns than they would otherwise. But we originally started talking about distant work and remote work, and one of the key things that we're seeing missing and challenged at the moment is the appropriate corporate culture. And this is what people have been talking throughout all the session today. And this is specifically the fact that not all the companies are prepared. And it's very difficult for many companies to make the transition. We're lucky to be one of the companies that has made the transition. As you can see around me, it doesn't look like I'm in the office right now. But still, for many companies, it's a very hefty and very serious challenge, and one that not many people are having an easy time with. And that's why we need the guides and special guidelines for that. Talking about trends, because this is always the question. We have already tackled the mass of them, but I just wanted to outline what we are looking at. We are mostly working in line with Gartner on this, because we believe that in this particular domain, in office tech and things that relate to work technologies and stuff that has to happen in the office, new tech will be coming from several main directions. And I actually have a slide. Let me see if I can pull it up. I've actually made even more, but I think as there are probably like 12 of us remaining right now here watching this at the moment, I don't think this is going to be much of an issue. So let me see. Yeah, basically what this is about is that there are 5 hearty trends that do describe what's happening at the moment. And most of these trends we've already discussed, but some I would actually speak a bit more about. When we're talking about remote work, it's more appropriate that we actually talk about distributed work, because what's happening is that nowadays you can have a day or two in the office, so-called presence days, and the rest of the time you're working from home. And this is the way that it's probably going to be. This comes with an added mobility. It doesn't mean still that you're going to move out of a different country, and it's a big issue with all the migration issues and stuff. So I don't think that this is going to be really a dominant issue in the nearest times. And seeing how more than 50% of the world's population are currently still employed in agriculture and industry as opposed to service industry, we don't think that this is going to be, like such a radical change anyways. And therefore, there are certain demands that they have to tackle. Because distributed work comes with the necessity to come and go as you need. It means that you need to be flexible, that the office needs to be flexible. It means that most offices will need to be equipped with IoT, so that the headsets that I wear right now could be embedded. For example, whenever I arrive at the office, they could become my phone immediately. I wouldn't need to do that. I could use any available machine and stuff. So this is the thin client, the way it should be done. And the rest of it with the cybersecurity that's needed to enable this technology in workplace. And moving on and moving on. Next on, we would talk about EdTech. And the thing here is very simple. First of all, the education is changing in nature because a lot of new people are coming to it. And we're seeing that the companies that provide these services, they're able to reevaluate their efficiency, and they're able to raise their efficacy significantly. And this comes out from the fact that now they have new teaching practices. When you're online, it doesn't work the same way like if you were in a class. And the other part of it is that obviously, because the corporates do work a lot with people who are not always in the workplace, they have to communicate their culture to them. And if you have a certain corporate culture, people have to adopt it. And this is why you need onboarding practices, and you need specific tools that would monitor the way people fit into this system. So this is also going to be one of the major trends, the onboarding and the EdTech. A lot of things have already been said about vertically integrated IT. This essentially means that you should be working on a single platform or on an array of platforms that are very tightly knit together. And this is probably as simple as it gets. The AI revolution, nobody has mentioned that, but this is going to be a threat to the employment market. And we already see it happening with digital assistants. We see it happening with digital HR services, and obviously the bookkeeping. So a lot of stuff is going to be delegated to artificial intelligence soon. We'll see that a lot of professions do disappear or do change significantly. And obviously many menial tasks will also be delegated. So this way the face of the employment will change definitely. And as we're talking about remote and distance working, these technologies do really help you get still connected to what's happening in the company. And finally, the democratization of IT, which is the funniest of them all. It's the quite popular now no-code movement and the new no-code technologies that actually have you program stuff, do macros, and create new value without being able to program per se. So you don't have the profit, you don't have the education, you don't know how these things are done, but nonetheless, you're still able to create new bits of software, new solutions that do perform specific functions for you. And that's why they call them citizen programmers, right? Because this is something for people who are not from the IT environment who can still benefit from it. And this is going to really change the face of software and the way people work in the workplace. Right, because, well, probably I'm the last one, so it's not, wouldn't be too good to continue holding people here. So thank you so much.
Last but one, but nevertheless, thank you very much for this. And I think the last point, you really gave some hope on the democratization of IT, because several speakers today mentioned that there is a high risk that people who do not have strong IT skills, and of course those who are not programmers, they might end up being left out of this digitalization wave. So hopefully this is something that help them still be employed, etc. But overall, the picture you pointed was quite rousing, that you still managed to get 6 times more capitalization, that there's such positive trends and automation is coming. I actually would like our last speaker, Irina Bukhovskaya, who is a partner from EY and deals with tax services, ground us all a little bit and talk about maybe not so pleasant and rousy, but still very important and very material things, such as how actually the taxation schemes would be different with us as we face better human mobility and increased work across the borders.
Okay. Yeah, can you see the slides and hear me well?
Not yet.
Okay. Working now?
Yes, we can.
Good. Okay, I think I need to be much quicker and shorter than every speaker before, so I will be quick. I also wanted to share some of the kind of charts and graphs based on our survey, but I will be again here, and I will just say that it confirms that all the preceding speakers have mentioned. The expectations from the business are that from 15 to 17% of employees will be 15 to 17% businesses expect that from 75 to 100% of employees will work and continue working remotely, and 37% will employers expect that from 25 to 50% of employees will continue to work remotely. So it means that it is less than we're facing now, but the remote work will continue. And on that basis, I just wanted to share briefly a few questions or challenges which I think governments of various countries have to decide on and take certain actions, and obviously the challenges which employers and employees are facing nowadays and will continue facing unless clarity is given by the government. So first of all is the block of issues, which I think also some of the speakers have touched based on. These are key migration challenges and decisions that the governments need to take. First of all, is the state itself willing to promote itself as a hub for virtual businesses? Meaning that, does it want to create a place for virtual placing of those businesses which basically have remote workforce? how is it going to account for that remote workforce as migrants, which require special, which are restricted or which are allowed, and which basically form part of the workforce quotas, or there is no need to calculate them as part of workforce quota? I mean, highly paid employees, which now require special permissions. I think we all need to understand that now many businesses, having tried and tested remote work, have an appetite to search for their employees beyond the boundaries of a specific city, but sometimes even beyond the boundaries of a specific country. And the question is, if I want to have an employee located in India, US, UK, elsewhere, which will be obviously working as under contractual arrangement, will that quasi-employee constitute an employee subject to those migration quotas, or I'm free to hire anyone in the world who I want to hire? And I think this is a crucial answer for any state, crucial question to which any state needs to answer, and this will determine the policy around the workflows and the limitations which each country will have. The other question which I think the states would need to answer is that as to whether such employees or quasi-employees will, I think one of the previous speakers had mentioned what's the difference between an employee and someone who has a contractual arrangement, if it is remote work. Is there any difference? And if there is no difference, what will happen to security, social charges, and incidental insurance if a remote worker is located elsewhere? Which rules will apply? Would the rules of the country where that quasi-employee, to which that quasi-employee reports or works, or where he's physically located, apply? That's, I think, a consensus which also needs to be reached by the countries, and the respective kind of rules shared with the employment society. And the other question is about regulatory requirements. Would the countries be willing to lift or make relief of the regulatory and professional regulatory requirements for certain types of industries like insurance, bank, pharmacy? Can I hire anybody in this world to service, I don't know, a Russian or US bank? Or would there be a unified kind of community of those professionals, or countries would be willing to protect its own labor force? So these are the type of questions which I think need to be answered by the government. And I also mentioned one of the quite, simple questions, but still which requires an answer, is you mentioned, I think, Margarita, in the very beginning, that you're working on labor legislation in Russia. I think many countries are facing that they need to be labor around remote work, and most importantly, probably mixed type of work, where you partly work from the office and partly somewhere else. So that's the first block of questions which I believe need to be answered. The other type of questions is around taxation, and this is also where governments need to respond to those questions in some form, or at least at some point, is that having an employees all over the world, and I mentioned we all have appetites now to recruit anyone in this world who is best positioned to fulfill the respective task. Having that, a lot of people around the world may create taxable presence. And question to each of the countries is obviously, what's that minimum threshold? How many employees? For how long do they kind of will trigger that taxable presence in a specific country? And the other question is, if we look into, I think the outflow of the workforce from the most of the mega cities, which I think we've discussed multiple times today, what it means, again, from tax perspective for regions. If we look into many countries, then those, in some of the countries, sorry, individual income tax would go to the federal budget or a budget of revenue where the employer is located. Question is, if that that workforce moves towards smaller cities in the country, does it mean that the tax needs to be paid in some other form or manner, basically to subsidize the territories where people actually live, where the infrastructure is needed? So does it change actually the taxation system of a specific country? And I think that's also the question to the government. And the other question, is there any triggering event for changing the tax system to maybe to think about some sort of franchise taxes? So if intellectual property is created by many employees all over the world, but the hub itself is located in a specific country, do governments think that they somehow want to tax those individuals or that company in the countries of location of that individual based on the value created in the country of the employer? So that's a tremendous change to the taxation system, which, you know, maybe a thoughts about. And I need to mention, obviously, property-linked taxation, such as generally property tax. What if an employee or a set of employees work in certain remote locations in various collaboration areas and, I don't know, rent out premises or buy certain equipment? Does it create something that is chargeable to property tax? That's also a question, and at which territories now? The other set of questions which I just briefly wanted to mention, these are the thoughts which bother the minds of the employers and the employees, is that you know, having now an ability to work, as was just recently mentioned, for two employers and potentially in different countries, while living himself or herself in a third country, it creates a lot of complications for the employees as to where they need to pay those taxes in the place where the employer is, or in the place where that specific individual is located. So it may lead to multiple taxations, which in some cases, like the US, cannot be eliminated by double taxation treaties, as may be the case, for instance, if the worker is located in Russia and works in the US, for example, where there is a double taxation treaty which eliminates double taxation. So some countries have to work on that, while some countries do not face such an issue where they are located within the same territory. It's only a matter to which budget the regional or the federal the tax goes. The other thing is, which I think worth mentioning briefly, so that I do not pick up even the third hour of our conference, is the digital services tax, which is being implemented by a number of countries, and it is usually charged on a user basis, which means that where the user is, that's where the tax is created. So if this is also properly structured, that may be a good source of revenue for the region where the employees are located, which needs basically those taxes. However, if the employer is in a completely different location, then that may create, again, either double taxation or inconsistent taxation claims from the tax authority. I think I can continue a lot. I think taxes is a broad area and actually a derivative from everything that has been discussed before. So I will stop by here. I just wanted to mention a number of actions have to be taken, you know, to address challenges of the employers and employees in this flexible working arrangement.
Yeah, thank you very much, Irina. In fact, you really posed more questions, answers, and added more things that we all should think about as employees, as employers, as governments, and as people who move around the country. And thank you very much for grounding us and mentioning all of this major, maybe not that interesting and exciting, but actually very important things we all should take care of. I think we're terribly over time, so it's time for us to close the discussion. I see there's one question to John Messenger, but I think that John has already left. So to any of the speakers who is still with us, if you want to give 30 seconds takeaway, like your main takeaway from today's discussion, or key thing that you change your mind or still you stayed in your mind, please do share. Anyone who's willing to take the floor? Maybe from the first.
I think we're all terribly in agreement. That's the problem, because this, there is no competition here. We all are aware of the significant changes that are happening and the tremendous movements that are affecting both people and migration and the processes that are connected with it. It's just, we all have our own take on this, and this is what we've wanted to share with people, the way we see it, the way we see the problems, the prospects for growth, and possibly the ways that we could actually work together to better that, to work for a better future.
Thank you, Dmitry. If anyone else?
Well, I was actually, I was intrigued by the final presentation, and I thought it was a great way to actually round it off. I guess my concern on the tax issue is whether or not we can get cooperation on this issue, because ultimately there is a risk that this becomes a race to the bottom, because people will be competing on these issues, and there is it could become a very, very messy game. And that's where some of my fears are. But rather than get cooperation, we get some real competition in a time when governments are going to be challenged fiscally. So I'll be watching those sets of issues very, very carefully. Thank you.
I would like to thank all the presentations. I really learned a lot. I really want to thank everyone, especially the private sector presentations. It provided me with new insights on this. On Ed's issue about regional cooperation, yes, I mean, that would definitely be a game changer here if we can get some form of regional cooperation going on. I'm from APEC. Hopefully we can step up to the plate on this issue. I think what all the presentations are saying is that the fourth industrial revolution, like the previous industrial revolutions, is a major change in everything, in how we organize our economies, how we organize our societies, even how we organize our politics. So it will be a total reorganization and rethinking of economic structures and priorities. And yeah, it's an interesting change. It's a very exciting time, and yeah, COVID-19 just made it more urgent than ever. So I hope we can all work together and learn from each other and address these issues. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Manuel. Indeed, I myself learned a lot as well on this topic, and thank you very much all for joining and sharing this knowledge. We'll stay in touch. So I have most slides from the most speakers, and I definitely have all the contacts. So in case you want to reach out to any of the speakers, please do reach out to me. I will connect you. And definitely let's share more of the new research that will be coming in. I'm sure you all will have new data in a few months. And unfortunately, if the second wave is coming, we'll have more food for thought and maybe more severe impacts on our economies and societies. But as discussed today, there are also positive changes as we're all forced to digitize faster, better, and more productively. So with this, thank you all very much for joining, and take care of yourself. This COVID is still not over. Thank you very much.